Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa afdal salati wa atammu taslim ala nabiyyina wa habibina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Allahumma allimna ma yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima 'allamtana wa zidna 'ilma. Allahumma zidna wa la tunqusna wa akrimna wa la tuhinna wa atina wa la tahrimna wa athirna wa la tu'thir 'alayna warda 'anna wa ardina ya Rabbil Alameen. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome back to the Lamppost Education Initiative's special broadcast and study of the creed of Imam Tahawi, entitled Renewing Faith in a Faithless World. And today, inshallah, we're going to be speaking quite a bit about the matter or the status of the Sahaba. But before that, I wanted to just review a little bit of what we covered last week, but also read a couple of other verses which they precede the discussion of the Sahaba. So the last verse that we discussed last week was the verse 113 from the translation of Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's of the Tahawi, Imam Tahawi's creed, where Imam Tahawi, he said, وَفِي دُعَاءِ الْأَحْيَاءِ وَصَدَقَاتِهِمْ مَنْفَعَةٌ لِلْأَمْوَاتِ. In the supplications and charities of the living, there is benefit for the dead. So we talked about how the reason that Imam Tahawi mentions this verse first and foremost was because the Mu'tazila's viewpoint was that once a person leaves this world, then there's nothing that can be done to benefit the individual after death. And so Imam Tahawi basically says that, well, not so fast. That if a person, there are reports that clearly indicate that if someone were to give charity on the behalf of an individual who's a Muslim who dies, then that charity given in the name of that person, dedicated to that person, will reach, or the reward of that charity will reach the individual. And so there was an incident when the companion Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas had come to the Prophet ﷺ, informing him of the death of his mother, and he asked the Prophet ﷺ, what is the best form of charity that one could give to benefit one's parents after they die? And so the Prophet ﷺ said, water. So Sa'd then had a well excavated or dug up, and he dedicated that well to his mother. Hadihi li Sa'd. This is for Sa'd, which is the mother of Sa'd. And on top of that, we all pray Salatul Janazah and we make dua for people after they die. And had it been true that there's nothing or no way to benefit you after death, or anyone else other than yourself to benefit yourself after death, then there would be no point of praying Salatul Janazah. There would be no point of making dua. Now, these two particular points are, we can say, areas of agreement, and this is why Imam Tahawi, he restricted his statement to charity and dua. Whereas there are other things that we talked a little bit about where there have been a point of disagreement among the scholars, such as reciting the Quran, and we call sort of doing the khatam of Quran for people. Is it possible that you pray on someone else's behalf, like pray nafil, or sort of like voluntary prayers, and then ask Allah to give the reward of those prayers to someone else? And also Hajj is another example of that. When a person has already left this world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it an obligation upon you to make the Hajj as long as you have the capacity. But once you have passed on, that capacity has been removed. So the question becomes, if one were to perform Hajj on your behalf, does it count, right? You're getting reward. And that is a point of disagreement among the ulama. So Imam Tahawi wanted to limit himself to the matters that are a point of agreement amongst Sunnis. And also the fact that this is a reference to something related to practices, as opposed to creed or belief, right? That, of course, there is sort of a connection, to belief, but it's not a purely theological or creedal matter that we're dealing with here, right? So the reason he puts this here is because this book is written to distinguish the beliefs of Sunnis from other groups of Muslims. And then he says, Wallahu ta'ala yastajibu da'wati wa yaqdi al-hajat. God, the Sublime and Exalted, answers prayers and fulfills needs. So Allah, He answers prayers and He fulfills needs. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always answers prayers, believe it or not, right? Said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always answer a prayer. In the Quran, He says, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ. That whenever my servants ask about me, then I am near. I answer the prayer of the one who supplicates when he supplicates. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala making a categorical declaration that He answers prayers. You make a supplication, Allah is going to answer. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always answers. This answer is not always yes. Sometimes His answers, or many times His answer is no, right? So He does always answer, right? But even in those cases when He says yes, it doesn't always give what is asked for immediately, right? He may give it to you, a little sometime, maybe a year later, maybe later in your life, maybe afterlife. He reserved the reward of it after that, or the gift or the response to that prayer after we leave this world, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees some great benefit in delaying that particular reward for you, or He'll give you something better than what you asked for, right? So the hadith of the Prophet mentions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He answers prayers as long as one doesn't make dua or supplicate or pray for qati'at rahim is bi ithmin madam yad'u bi ithmin or qati'at rahim, as long as you don't ask for something which is sinful, or cutting off ties of kinship, something which would lead to cutting off the ties of kinship, So, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always answer, and then one person, he said, and also ma lam ta'jal, as long as you do not lose patience, as long as you're not hasty, saying da'utuhu falam yustajab li, I prayed but He didn't answer my prayer. Right. And this actually is a situation you find with certain Muslims, especially new Muslims, who come in, and often we have this transactional expectation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we say, okay, I'm going to become Muslim and I'm asked to pray 5 times a day. And my prayers, my salawats, khams, are supposed to be not only fulfillment of an obligation, but also because during those prayers, I ask for things that I want in my life. And so some people, unfortunately, what happens is that they'll pray for those things while they're, or at the end of their prayers, but then they don't receive them in the time where they think that they deserve to receive them. And then because they don't receive them, then they decide, I'm not going to pray. I'm not praying anymore. Hey, well, I've been praying all this time and Allah, He hasn't answered my prayers. So it has to mean that the prayers don't work. That these 5 daily prayers, there is no causal link between my prayers and what's supposed to my prayers and the obligations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed on my back. So they do this, right? So, but the problem is that that people have a misunderstanding, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't owe us anything, first and foremost. We owe everything to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And even if we do things like prayer, fulfill the prayers, we're not doing anything that's benefiting God. We're doing things that are benefiting ourselves. And we perform the prayers, we pray them in the Arabic language. This is just simply an expectation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has of us, But there are other things, prayers that come from our hearts, usually when we pray in our own languages, that we supplicate Allah at any given time, right? The woman can't pray at certain times of the month, as we know, right? But they can make dua at any time they want to, right? So and those are the more sincere prayers, at least for those who don't understand or speak fluently in Arabic, or have a full comprehension of what they're saying if they're praying in the Arabic language, or so your original language, your supplications are extremely important. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He answers. So you have to believe that Allah answers prayers, right? There's a hadith where the Prophet says that that pray to God while being certain of a response. You have certainty of a response. فإن الله لا يقبل دعاء من قلب غافل لاهٍ, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He does not accept a prayer from a heedless, mindless, or a heedless, heedless heart, right? From a heart which is heedless, right? A heart which is not present with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you pray, you have a certain certainty that Allah is going to answer. It might not be yes, but it might be as well. But it may not be if you not receive what you're looking for right now, right? But Allah is going to answer regardless, and you have to be certain that you're going to receive an answer. And again, as long as you're not asking for something which is sinful, if you receive an answer to something that is sinful that you pray for, then there's probably a sign of Allah's anger with you. If anything, it may be a sign of being cursed, right? Even right. So we don't want that to happen. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He protect us from that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He not only answers the prayers of believers, but according to many scholars, He answers the prayers of oppressed non-believers as well. There's actually a hadith, very famous hadith, where at the end of it, the Prophet ﷺ says, وَإِيَّاكُمْ وَدَعْوَةَ الْمَظْلُومِ فَإِنَّهُ لَيْسَ بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَ اللَّهِ حِجَابٌ. فَإِنَّهُ لَيْسَ بَيْنَهَا وَبَيْنَهَا وَبَيْنَ اللَّهِ حِجَابٌ. That beware of the prayer of the oppressed, because there's no screen or veil between or barrier between it and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's one narration, one version of the hadith that says, وَأَنَّ دَعْوَةَ الْمَظْلُومِ مُسْتَجَابَةٌ وَلَوْ كَانَ كَافِرًا, right? That the prayer of the oppressed is answered even if the person happens to be a non-Muslim, right? So because of this, those many scholars have said, okay, well, if the individual is in a state of tyranny or oppression, that when they pray, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually he answers their prayers as well. Majority of the ulama have a different position about this, and actually say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't answer the prayers of the non-believers, because in the Quran He says, وَمَا دُعَاءُ الْكَافِرِينَ إِلَّا فِي ضَلَالٍ, right? And the prayers of those who are not Muslims or those who reject faith are they're useless. That they go they veer off the path. That they are not mustaqim. They're not of the like that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will accept, right? On the other hand, but those who accept this viewpoint and say, okay, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He does answer the prayers of kuffar, like because He answered the prayer of Iblis, where He says, Rabbi anzirni ila yawm yub'athun, my Lord, grant me respite, give me a delay until the day that they are resurrected. قَالَ فَإِنَّكَ مِنَ الْمُنظَرِينَ. And so He responded, saying to him, you are among those granted respite. Right? So they say, okay, this is evidence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will answer even the prayers of the kuffar. But anyway, this is something Yawm al-Qiyamah eventually will find out the truth of, right? But Imam Tahawi, the way he's worded, he didn't say that Allah He answers the prayers of the Muslims. He says that Allah He answers prayers, right? Which means all prayers, right? Be they from non-Muslims or non-Muslims, so He sort of covers his bases. وَيَقْضِي الْحَاجَاتِ, and He also fulfills needs. He fulfills needs. وَمَا مِن دَابَّةٍ فِي الْأَرْضِ إِلَّا عَلَى اللَّهِ رِزْقُهَا. There's not a single creature on the earth except that it is upon God to grant them provision, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants provision for every creature on the earth, right? Of the smallest to the largest, right? It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who grants us food, He grants us drink, He grants us nourishment. The baby, all the nourishment that he needs is in his mother's milk, right? Right. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He fulfills needs, the things that not only that keep us alive, but the things that remove hardship as well. Allah give us a mind, right? Give us reason and intelligence so that we ourselves can utilize our intelligence to create things that make life easier as well. And that's actually due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَيَمْلِكُ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ وَلَا يَمْلِكُهُ شَيْءٍ. He possesses everything and nothing possesses Him. Pretty straightforward. Allah possesses everything. All but everything belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Your wealth belongs to God. Your children belong to God. Right? Your very person, you yourself, you belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are called ibadullah. We got Allah's servants, Allah's slaves. We're called slaves as well. Ibad and abid in the Quran. So we don't. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala controls everything. He possesses everything. This is His mulk. His mulk. He's, of course, the creator of mulk and malakut, right? And alim al-ghayb wa shahada. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not possessed by anything. Then He said, وَلَا يُسْتَغْنَى عَنِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى طَرْفَةَ عَيْنٍ وَمَنْ اسْتَغْنَى عَنِ اللَّهِ طَرْفَةَ عَيْنٍ فَقَدْ كَفَرَ وَصَارَ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْخُسْرَانِ. Nothing is independent of God. even for the twinkling of an eye. Whoever imagined his independent of God for even the twinkling of an eye has disbelieved and is among those brought to ruin. Right. So these are sort of ideas that are very clear. Imam Tahawi he's of course he's reminding us of these things. Don't require much explanation. And then he says in verse 117, وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ يَغْضَبُ وَيَرْضَى لَا كَأَحَدٍ مِّنَ الْوَرَى. God has wrath and pleasure. He has wrath and pleasure, but not like that of any human. Now, the reason this is introduced as well is because of controversy, historical controversy between different Muslim factions about what type of attributes are befitting Allah's majesty, right? Some of the things attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives the impression that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like his creation, that people anthropomorphize God, right? That he equated Allah to creation, that people read into the text what the text believed has not have intended, right? And so we talked before about the matter of hands and eyes and feet and etc., right, which are attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran and Hadith, right? Yeah, but all those attributions real, right? They are true attributes in the normal sense of things, right? You know, especially considering that these are attributes we know are similar to what the human being has, right? And so when the Prophet said, "Inna Allah khalaqa Adam ala surati," that Allah he created Adam upon his image or in his image, it doesn't mean that, you know, the ulama historically did not mean by that or understand this to mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had a corporeal, a sort of a physical sort of image in the way that we all do have, you know. But rather, you have one faction who said, yes, that these are all attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are real attributes, but we just never seen them before. Yeah, others who actually went to another extreme and said that, yes, these are exactly, that Allah has the attributes exactly the way that we have them, that Allah's hands look just like ours, his eyes look like our eyes, etc., etc. And that's, of course, those factions were declared to be non-Muslims by all of the mainstream groups of Muslim. And then you had, of course, the other extreme, which would be that none of these words are to be taken literally, and they're not attributes, nor do they refer back to any true attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It just matters of language, you know, and anyone who were to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has any of these things are kuffar, you know, so that was another extreme, you know. But what it was declared to be a position of balance and safety was what is called the method of the Salaf, and that is to say that we know what these words mean in the language, and we know that outwardly they suggest one thing, and the outward intent of them can't be what is meant for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that would mean that Allah is like his creation, and he's already stated more than one place in the Quran that there's nothing like unto him. And so we accept the word and what it means apparent, you know, and so we say that Allah knows best what is meant by it, but we deny the outward meaning of it, right? Because that particular meaning is unbefitting of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is why we find statements like the one attributed to Imam Shafi'i, amantu billah wa bima ja'anillah ala muradillah. You know, that I believe in Allah and what has come about Allah according to the intent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when he says that Allah, he gets angry, or he has wrath, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has pleasure, you know, that, you know, instead of getting to the interpretation of exactly what's meant by anger and pleasure, we know what it means for ourselves, you know, because if I'm angry, then my heart, or the blood in my heart, sort of, you know, comes whatever boils. They would say in the old days, they say, you know, the غيران القلب لإرادة انتقام, right? You know, when the heart boils out of a desire to take vengeance. So that, of course, is not what's meant by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because then you're attributing to Allah heart as well, and you're, you know, all these other things as well. But Imam Tahawi, he just says, hey, listen, Allah, he gets angry, he has wrath, he has pleasure, you know, but not like any other creation, because, you know, if you were to say it's like anything of the creation, then that itself would be kufr. As he stated earlier in the text, وَمَنْ وَصَفَ اللَّهَ بِمَعْنًى مِنْ مَعَادِ الْبَشَرِ فَقَدْ كَفَرَ. That whoever describes Allah with one of the attributes of creation or attributes of mortals, then that individual is guilty of kufr, is guilty of ingratitude, but also guilty of unbelief, right? So you just, hey, we say what it is, and we keep moving, إِمْرَارُهَا كَمَا جَاءَتْ, let them pass as they have come without trying to alter and say it means something other than what it's meant in the language, except that we deny what is outward. Now, this brings us to the more important, well, I would say more important, but the topic of the day, right? That this particular lesson, the way it was entitled, is in such a way that perhaps many of you believe that the only thing we'll be talking about today was the Sahaba, the position of the Sahaba. And so the next verse, 118, Imam Tahawi, he says the following: وَنُحِبُّ أَصْحَابَ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ وَلَا نُفَرِّطُ فِي حُبِّ أَحَدٍ مِّنْهُمْ وَلَا نَتَبَرَّأُ مِنْ أَحَدٍ مِّنْهُمْ وَنُبْغِضُ مَنْ يُبْغِضُهُمْ وَبِغَيْرِ خَيْرٍ لَا نَذْكُرُهُمْ وَحُبُّهُمْ دِينٌ وَإِيمَانٌ وَإِحْسَانٌ وَبُغْضُهُمْ كُفْرٌ وَنِفَاقٌ وَطُغْيَانٌ. We love the companions of God's Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We are not, however, extreme in our love for any one of them, nor do we disassociate from any of them. We loathe those who loathe them, and we only mention their merits. Loving them is essential to religion, faith, and spiritual excellence, and hating them amounts to infidelity, hypocrisy, and extremism. So this is really interesting because it wasn't originally planned that this particular discussion would coincide with a major controversy that's happening, in particular in the UK right now, where we see a movie that was published. I guess it's published. What do we say for movies? It was released. A movie was released in 2021 entitled "The Woman of Heaven," if I'm correct, or "The Lady of Heaven," right? So, and this movie was produced by a Shiite producer who wanted to do a film connected with Our Lady Fatimah al-Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wa radiyallahu anha. And the film stirred up quite a bit of controversy, and because in the film views of Shiite Muslims are highlighted, and in particular, this film makes the claim that that Abu Bakr and Umar radiyallahu anhuma were responsible for the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Now, of course, as a Sunni, you find that to be ridiculous when you hear it, But this is one of the messages of the movie. This is a belief that embraced by many Shi'ah, and so the film depicts them in such a way, because we already know, all of us know that the Shi'ah generally that they have a very bad opinion, to say the least, of the khulafa of the two khalifas in particular, and also Uthman, but in particular Abu Bakr and Umar radiyallahu anhuma. And mainstream Shi'ism teaches that they were not Muslims, or they were hypocrites, right? And billah. So this movie depicts them in that way. But also, I haven't seen the movie, but this is fundamentally what is said about the movie, that they say that Abu Bakr and Umar, that they said that they are the source of like the extreme. The movie sent the message that that the source of extremism or terrorism in Islamic history goes all the way back to Abu Bakr and Umar, having killed or whatever, been responsible for the death of the Prophet ﷺ and certain other important people from Ahlul Bayt, and then also they're very critical as well, according to what I've read or heard, of Aisha radiallahu anha, al-Mu'mineen, and that itself also is not a new issue. And we know about that, and a very low opinion that they have of al-Mu'mineen Aisha radiallahu anha. But the other thing that's interesting about this too is that it said that the actors who are utilized to depict Abu Bakr and Umar are either originally African, Black African, Sub-Saharan African actors, or at least they're dark, very dark-skinned Shi'ah themselves, who of course embrace this viewpoint, which is really interesting because the racial element is involved here. Now, the film was released, and then it started to spread throughout the UK, and then a lot of Muslims, they protested the movie, and apparently they've been able to shut down or force the cinemas to remove it from their theaters, right? As a result of that, right? And so I was already originally planning to talk about this, and this is something that just came up over the last week or so. And so the question related to the position or the status of the Sahaba is an extremely important thing to talk about. So this is what we call one of the secondary matters of Islamic creed. Right? In other words, I'm sorry. It's another issue of the Khulafa. That's really what I'm talking about. But this is a primary issue of creed in the sense that the Quran is very clear in multiple verses about the status of the Sahaba. That the status of the Sahaba is great, right? With Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are many different verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praises the Sahaba. And Surah Tawbah, it said one of the most famous verses, السابقون الأولون من المهاجرين والأنصار والذين اتبعوهم بإحسان رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه وأعد لهم جنات تجري تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا ذلك فوز عظيم. That the first and foremost from the Muhajirin and the Ansar and those follow them in goodness, Allah is well pleased with them and they are pleased with Him, and we prepare for them gardens under which rivers flow, where they would dwell therein forever, and that is the great achievement, right? So this is one of many different verses in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the status of the Sahaba. Muhammadur Rasulullah walladina ma'ahu ashidda'u 'ala al-kuffari ruhama'u bainahum. Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and those who are with him, they are firm against the enemies of faith, the kuffar, and they are compassionate with one another. You see them bowing and prostrating, seeking the bounty of the Lord and His satisfaction. Their marks of distinction are noticed in the traces of prostration, right, on their faces, right? So and it goes on and continues. So they talk about the Torah and the Injil describe the Sahaba. So the previous scriptures even talk about the Sahaba, which is really interesting, because there's actually a hadith of it was a statement made by Abdullah bin Mas'ud, one of the great early Sahaba, which says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He نظر في قلوب العباد, that He looked into the hearts of all people, right? And He saw that the heart of the Prophet ﷺ was the best and purest of all hearts. And then He looked, right, upon the hearts of others, right, outside of the Prophet, other than the Prophet ﷺ, and He noticed that those with the best of hearts were those among His companions, right? Right? So it is there hadiths like this that are praising the Sahaba, right? So they are not only praising the Quran but praise in previous scriptures, right? And so for this particular reason, you find those scholars, many scholars who actually objected to the position taken by the Shi'ah, stating or characterizing the great Sahaba, in particular the Sabiqun al-Awwalun, those who are the first and foremost, the forerunners among the Sahaba, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, and among others, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, and the 10 Promised Jannah, etc., that describing many of them as, in the way that they described them, right? And so scholars would say, okay, well, if you were asked a Christian, who after Jesus, after Isa bin Maryam, who are the best of people? They would say the best of his people are the disciples, right? And if you were asked the Jews, who were the best people after Musa alayhi salam, and say the best people after Musa are those who carried on his legacy, those who are his disciples as well. And but if you ask again the extreme among the Shi'ah, you ask them among who are the best among of the best people of the Ummah, best people among after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? You know, of course they will find a select group of people, but the vast majority, it seems that they of the Sahaba, that they have major problem. You know, so it's fundamentally, so some scholars say there's a sign, okay, this makes them worse than the Jews and the Christians, in that they would actually declare that the actual disciples and followers of the Prophet ﷺ were the worst of people, right? And so the Prophet had Abu Bakr and Umar very close to him, so they themselves, they aim at the closest people to him, Abu Bakr and Umar, right? Radiallahu anhuma. And of course, Uthman, you know, of course, he himself, you know, they have an issue with him as well, but not so much as Abu Bakr and Umar, the most influential of the Sahaba, right? So why would you say that the close disciples, the close companions of the Prophet are the worst of all of the Ummah, right? Or worst of the people, or worst people after the Messenger, right? So it's really interesting, you know. So fundamentally, Imam Tahawi says, no, we love the companions of God's Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We are not, however, extreme in our love for any one of them, right? In other words, we don't go extreme. We don't go to extremes in any love for Ali ibn Abi Talib, radiallahu anhu, nor do we go to an extreme in any love for Muawiyah, because you know that in itself was the major split itself, you know, the civil war between the two of them, right? And so the Sunni is actually similar to the Shia. Actually say that when in the dispute between Ali and Muawiyah, Ali actually was upon the truth, kind of al-haq, that Ali ibn Abi Talib actually was he was the rightful Khalifa, right? And so that fundamental distinction was a fundamental clash about whether or not Muawiyah should come and give bay'ah to Ali, or should they go and locate the assassins of Uthman radiallahu anhu. That in that particular debate, Ali was right. He was the rightful Khalifa. Say, okay, come give me bay'ah first, then let's unite the Ummah, then we'll go hunt down these people. Now, of course, Muawiyah didn't trust that, because there were rumors saying that Ali himself was partially responsible for the death of Uthman, in the sense that, you know, he himself and some of his progeny were actually supposed to be guarding Uthman, and so, among other things. There's many things you could get into, but this is not really the place to get into all these details. But fundamentally, as a general class of people, we love the Sahaba, right? You know, in other words, we love them because they had proximity to the Prophet ﷺ. They were the people who preserved the religion, who passed it down to us. They're those who actually went and they expanded the borders of Islam, the Islamic Empire, right? Right? They were the ones, right, who inspired later generations, right, to go and do more, right? So they are the source of all of our knowledge, all the knowledge we have of the Messenger, alayhi salatu wasalam. Why would we entertain any degree of hatred for them, right? You know, and of course, this is one of those areas where Sunnis and Shiites, we can't really reconcile. There's an irreconcilable issue here with regard to the Sunnis and Shiites on this point, because for the Shiites, they believe in wala, in other words, the issue of loyalty to the friends of God, right? And for them, they can't do wala without doing bara as well, right? They have to disassociate themselves too, right? So they believe that Abu Bakr and Umar, right? You know, that these are very evil people, right? That's what they believe, right? And they're responsible for some serious issues that happened in Islam, and they believe that denied Ali ibn Talib his right, and so it's fundamentally a clash of historical perspectives between Sunnis and Shiites. What actually did occur, and what didn't occur, right? So you actually can read Shiite history, and the history in certain areas, you know, makes sense, right? But I do think that just because something makes sense doesn't mean it actually happened, right? You know. But fundamentally, the Sunni position, in my view, is more reasonable because none of us was there. We have, of course, reports, you know, and we can
look at those reports and decide, okay, well, what criteria are we going to utilize to validate those reports? But even if we tried to utilize, say, for instance, the science of hadith to validate reports, I personally, and I think that other scholars, certain other scholars have this viewpoint as well, is that for a person believe that applying the same criteria we would apply to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ to determine sound Islamic teaching or not, it doesn't, you can't utilize the same criteria to validate or verify historical information, historical fact, right? Because history itself, the reporters of history often are not reliable people themselves. Like if you were to say, okay, we're going to exclude so-and-so because so-and-so committed a sin one time, or somebody knew the person told a lie at one time, and we say, okay, well, his report can't be true because he's unreliable. Yeah, but he was there, right? And there are other people similar to him who are also considered to be unreliable, and they're all saying the same thing. And I think this historical fact is a bit different than us being concerned about ensuring that the information coming from the Messenger ﷺ has sound chain of narration. Now, for many Shiites, or Shiites in general, for them, even if, excuse me, quite often, even without an isnad, a chain of narration, they might say, okay, well, I trust my imam, right? So the imam said this, I trust what the imam said, right? So in that sense, it becomes extremely difficult to reconcile between the Shiite perspective and the Sunni perspective. But we love the companions of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We don't go to any extremes in our love for either one of them. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, one of the great Sahaba, right? Certain Sahaba actually consider Ali ibn Abi Talib to be the greatest or the most virtuous of all of them. He was the best of all the Sahaba. There's some who held that. The people of Kufa generally considered Ali to be preferred to Uthman first and foremost, and many of them considered him to be the best of the Sahaba after the Messenger ﷺ. But the Sunni mainstream, we're going to see later, the Sunni mainstream had a different viewpoint on this, which is that it's Abu Bakr and then Umar, then Uthman, then Ali, and we'll come back to that. Yeah. So we don't go to extremes in our love for any one of them, nor do we disassociate it from any one of them. So there's another point I like to make here, which I think is important for Sunnis. While we say that we love the Sahaba, that itself should not mean that that we don't believe that certain Sahaba were better than others. It's very clear in the aqidah. Right? So some people think that simply because someone's a Sahabi, that it's not possible for us to sort of weigh that person's virtues against another's, right? There were Sahaba who committed sin, right? There were Sahaba who fought one another and killed one another. There were Sahaba who committed adultery, right? Who stole. There's Sahaba who lied, right? It happens something, So you do have those things that occur, right? But we're talking about just as a general category, a general class of people, that their virtue, their collective virtue is greater than our collective virtue, right? And so we love them. We don't go extremes. We don't disassociate from any of them, because if they had the ear of the Messenger ﷺ, and the Prophet brought them to their presence and trusted them in certain accounts, we consider them to be worthy of our love, right? Now, what I didn't get involved in yet is we call it sort of the definition of the Sahabi, right? And so here's another area where we would say that the Sunnis and Shiites, they differ, right? And this is why, for instance, you find that the Shiites don't consider people like Muawiyah and Abu Sufyan to be like Sahaba, right? They have a different definition of a Sahabi, right? For us, a Sahabi is anyone who met the Prophet ﷺ as a believer and died a believer, right? So you were a believer, you believed in him, you met him, and you died upon Islam, right? And of course, there's some nuance, some intervening subcategories which we can talk about. That's not for today, but it's mentioned in some of the books. But that is the standard definition of a Sahabi: someone who met the Prophet while believing him and died upon Islam. Right? There, Sufis actually, certain Sufis, they actually will go further than that, and they won't limit the Sahaba to human beings. They'll say, for instance, the jinn who believes in the Prophet also were Sahaba. The angels who fought at Badr were Sahaba. The rocks, the trees, and all the other animals and things that existed during his time were Sahaba too, but that's in itself is a bit more of a stretch, but a much more objective standard for us is that, okay, well, human being met the Messenger alayhi salam, while believer, believed in him and died upon Islam. But the Shiites have a different view of that, So for Sunnis, it doesn't really matter how long the person spent time in the Prophet's presence. But for them, and especially you find this definition emphasized, highlighted quite much among the Zaydi Shiites, say that you have to be among those who spend a significant amount of time, they spend a lot of time in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. This same definition actually is adopted in Usul al-Fiqh when it comes to the source called Qawl Sahabi, that the view of the Sahabi, right, as a source of Islamic teaching, right, it has to originate from someone who actually spent significant amount of time in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ in order for it to have the type of authority we wanted to have, right? So that in that sense, in Usul al-Fiqh, the Sunnis adopt the definition which is similar to that, or actually exactly the same as that among the Zaydiyah and other Shi'ah, right? So this is a source as well of one of those differences between us, is that so we don't loathe them, we loathe those who loathe them, right? We loathe, in other words, we hate, نُبْغِضُهُمْ مَنْ أَبْغَضَهُم, right? And there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he says, Allah fi ashabi, that be have taqwa, be conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala concerning my companions. لا تتخذوهم غرضا بعدي. Do not take them as a target after my death. Right? فمن أحبهم فبحبي أحبهم. So whoever loves them is because they love me. It's because they love me. They love them because they love me. ومن أبغضهم فببغضي أبغضهم. And if those who hate them, it is because they hate me that makes them hate them. In other words, their hatred for them is a sign that they hate me. Their love of them is a sign that they love me. And so it goes on, and the hadith continues and goes on and says that وَمَنْ أَذَاهُمْ أَذَانِي, that whoever hurts them hurts me. وَمَنْ أَذَانِي أَذَى اللَّهُ تَعَالَى, and whoever hurts me hurts God, right? And of course, we know you can't really hurt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he means that, of course, it offends God, right? So the Prophet ﷺ in this particular hadith is fundamentally connecting the love and hatred of the Sahaba with love and hatred of himself. Now, of course, naturally, this would be a hadith that the Shi'ah would not accept, right? And again, that'd be another source of disagreement between us, right? But fundamentally, the Sunni position is that if you hate, that you are to hate or loathe those who loathe the Sahaba, right? And we only mention their merits, right? So this is another part of it, that لا نذكرهم وبخير خير لا نذكرهم, right? Yeah, that we only mention their merits, right? In other words, we try to avoid mentioning the negative things that happen historically. Now, scholars have written about these things in detail. And so one can consult the books of history, so it's not as if the scholars were trying to hide what actually happened. The Sunni scholars have written extensively about this, and many different books about all of the conflicts between Sahaba. So fundamentally, what they're trying to do is discourage the public from taking a deep-seated position, political position, where we side with one faction of Sahaba against the other. Why? Because first and foremost, during times of crises, it's not always easy to know who is upon truth, right? Just consider the Arab Spring is an example. I think as a modern day example of clear confusion. Right? The Arab Spring happens. There are scholars who side with the regimes in the Arab world. And there are other scholars who are against them. And it wasn't as if it was a black or white issue. No, it wasn't. It wasn't clearly black or white, right? That this was the right thing to do. That everyone should be against everyone should be calling for a revolution. Everyone should be calling for the overthrow of their leaders, right? That wasn't right. clear, right? And in the midst of all of that madness, people took positions, right? Then after it's over, in hindsight, you could always say, that, oh, well, so-and-so was right, so-and-so was wrong. So I think of the past in this same light, in particular, the two civil wars in Islamic history. The common Muslim really, you don't know who's right, who's wrong, right? You kind of just go along with, you follow your tribe, you go along with them, see, and so when we start to mention who did what to who, then we start to develop a rancor in our hearts, that the Quran, one of the prayers that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us in the Quran with respect to our predecessors is رَبَّنَا اغْفِرْ لَنَا وَلِإِخْوَانِنَا الَّذِينَ سَبَقُونَا بِالْإِيمَانِ. Oh Allah, forgive us and forgive our brethren who has preceded us in faith. وَلَا تَجْعَلْ فِي قُلُوبِنَا غِلًّا لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا رَبَّنَا إِنَّكَ رَءُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ. And do not place any rancor and resentment in our hearts for those who believe. So Allah is telling us what to say, what to pray for. And part of what we find there is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He does not want for us to think ill of those who went before us. They were people of faith, right? And people of faith are not perfect, right? People of faith have flaws, right? Right, and that in itself would include even, again, many Sahaba, right? And so we have to understand too that, again, there are three. You can sort of divide the Sahaba into three different fractions. Right? So, for instance, you can say the pre-conquest, right, Sahaba, right, which would include those who believe with the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca, right, and those who eventually came and gave him bay'ah in Aqaba, right, and then eventually made hijrah with him to Medina, and then you have those. So the pre-Hudaybiyah Sahaba, pre-Hudaybiyah, and then there's the post-Hudaybiyah, and then there's the post-conquest of Mecca, right? So three sort of time periods, right? So you have about that pre-Hudaybiyah period. You're talking about some more than about 1,400 people, right, who had become Muslim by that time, right? Who the Quran is praising in the Quran. So, for instance, there's one verse in Surah Al-Hadid where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا يستوي منكم من أنفق من قبل الفتح وقاتل, right? That those who expended from their wealth and fought, right, before the conquest are not equal to those who did so after this. أولئك أعظم درجة من الذين أنفقوا من بعد وأنفقوا. أولئك أعظم درجة من الذين أنفقوا من بعد وقاتلوا. Right, and those are greater than those are greater in degree than those who spended their wealth and fought after the conquest. Right. So in other words, Allah is trying to make a distinction. Like, you're all Sahaba, but some of you accepted Islam early, others you wait until after the conquest. Right? And then, of course, people after the Hudaybiyah, people like Khalid bin Walid, Amr ibn As, who accepted Islam but prior to the conquest, right? We have those Muslims. And so, for instance, there's a famous story where there's a dispute between Abdurrahman ibn Auf, who were from the early Sahaba, the forerunners of the Sahaba, and then you had Khalid bin Walid, who becomes Muslim during or after Hudaybiyah. And Khalid had some negative things, and he spoke and reviled and insulted Abdurrahman ibn Auf, and the Prophet heard him, insult him. And then the Prophet said to him, "La tasubbu ashabi, do not revile my companions." And he said, if one of you were to give the equivalent of Mount Uhud in gold, that in itself would not equal what this person has expended in the way of Allah, nor even half of it. Right. So he's talking to Khalid bin Walid, he says this, because Khalid is speaking ill of Abdurrahman ibn Auf. So this is, so clearly there was a distinction between the Sahaba. Some of them are better than others. Clearly, that's what we believe, right? So we love all of them, but we love some more than we love others. So that's fine for us to do that. Now, but those who hate them, we are called to entertain hatred for them. And when we speak of the Sahaba, we should mention only their merits. It should be a practice in general about people in general. That, we don't want to demonize anyone, right? Or dehumanize people, because that's really what happens once you start to speak. They only talk about the characteristics. Everyone has good and bad characteristics, right? Exception of the Prophet ﷺ, right? And people, of course, the Anbiya and Rusul, right? But the rest of us, everyone has good and bad characteristics, right? So, but we only focus on the bad things, the bad choices they made, the bad decisions, the bad opinions they have. Then that in itself is going to demonize and dehumanize an individual, and then make it easier for their life to be taken, right? So we don't want to go to that extreme, right? So we remain silent about the negative things that happen for them. So he goes on and says, loving them is essential to religion, faith, and spiritual excellence. To love them is essential to that. And hating them amounts to infidelity, hypocrisy, and extremism. Right. So this is interesting. It's like you have people who would say that the Sahaba, right, or people like Abu Bakr and Umar are, what they say, right? And I always like to say, well, when did you get word from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you're going to Jannah? When did you get word from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you're not going to have hisab, you're not going to be reckoned? When did you get word that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to allow you to enter into Jannah before Abu Bakr and Umar? Right. So, no, of course, but to me, I found it so ridiculous that people would actually spend so much energy, right, actually cursing dead people. People have passed away. Tilka ummatun qad khalat laha ma kasabat wa lakum ma kasabtum. That is a nation, a generation who has already passed. They will get what they earned, and you will get what they earned. وَلَا يُسْأَلُونَ عَمَّا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ وَلَا تُسْأَلُونَ عَمَّا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. And you won't be asked about what they used to do. You won't be asked about what they did, So you only do what you can only do. You do. That we have our deeds, they have their deeds, right? So to expend so much energy, it really seems ridiculous to me. It's not something attractive to me at all, right? That someone will feel the need to actually expend so much energy in cursing someone or in promoting hatred of them, right? But fundamentally, Imam Tahawi is saying that to love them is a sign of spiritual excellence. To hatred itself is the opposite of that, is a sign of infidelity and hypocrisy and extremism or transgression, right? So it's just Sister Nabila says isn't that backbiting? I'm not totally sure exactly what particular reference you're making. Maybe you can just remind me of what particular part of that is backbiting. So he goes on and he says, وَنُثْبِتُ الْخِلَافَةَ بَعْدَ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ أَوَّلًا لِأَبِي بَكْرٍ الصِّدِّيقِ رضي الله عنه تفضيلا له وتقديما على جميع الأمة، ثم لعمر بن الخطاب رضي الله عنه، ثم لعثمان رضي الله عنه، ثم لعلي بن أبي طالب رضي الله عنه، وهم الخلفاء الراشدون والأئمة المهديون أو المهتدون. We assert that the caliphate after the death of the Messenger ﷺ was first for Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, due to his preeminence and precedence over the entire community, and then for Umar ibn Khattab, followed by Uthman ibn Affan, and concluding with Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhum ajma'in. They are the guided caliphs and guided leaders. So in other words, this is both affirming historical facts and also introducing an important part of Sunni creed. Right? So historical fact was that after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Bakr was the leader of the Ummah, and then that was followed by Umar, and it was followed by Uthman, and followed by Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. His historical fact. But Imam Tahawi adds to this, you know what? We have to embrace the Khilafah, that the Khilafah is legitimate. The legitimacy of the caliphate of these four men, right, after the Prophet. The reason he brings this up is because the Shiite position is that the caliphate of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman were illegitimate. Right? Why? Because only an imam can be the Khalifa. And we're talking about 12ers in particular. We're talking about the mainstream, the 12ers, right? Not the Zaydiyah. Zaydiyah have a different position with regard to the legitimacy of the Khilafah of the first three. And so the understanding of a Khalifa for the Shiites is different than it is for the Sunnis. Right? Now, for Shiites, Shi'ism, and particularly Twelverism, the imama is an article of faith, a tenet of faith. So we say we believe in Allah, His messengers, books, the angels, the last day. We believe in Qadr, right? So 6 articles of faith. The Shiites, they believe, and of course, Tawheed, they believe in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They believe in Ma'ad, the resurrection, the last hour of resurrection, etc., judgment. They believe in, of course, Al-Adl, right? The divine justice, or their version of it called predestination. They believe in the imama, right? So the imam, they believe in Nubuwah, they believe in prophets, the books, etc. They believe is what's called imama, right? So the infallible imam, right? So if you don't believe in the infallible imam, then you're not a Muslim, right? For Shiites. So you have to believe in that, right? And so the imam was synonymous with khalifa, right? Or the khalifa, the imam, only imam can be the khalifa, right? So for them, the imam is not only just a governor of Muslims, right? It's not just one who runs the empire, right? But he's also a spiritual source, a spiritual guide for the entire community. He's the one with the only authoritative interpretation of the Quran. Now we know for the 12ers, the 12 imams have come and gone, with the exception of Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Ashqari, who they say came and then he disappeared and shall return towards the end of time as the Mahdi. But fundamentally, Imam Ali, in their viewpoint, was supposed to be the Khalifa. They claim that the Prophet ﷺ, he ordered the Abu Bakr and Umar to appoint Ali as a Khalifa before his death, and all of them were aware that this was going to happen, but they disobeyed the orders of the Prophet out of personal interest. And so Abu Bakr became the Khalifa, and then after, upon his deathbed, he appointed Umar ibn Khattab. And Umar ibn Khattab, before he died, instead of him appointing Ali, he left the matter up to consultation between the elders of the community, right? So there are 10 elders, and they're going to mention in the following verse the 10 promised Jannah. And so it was left with the remaining elders, or the 8 remaining elders, in addition to his son Abdullah bin Umar, who was there to witness the appointment of Uthman, right? He left it up to them to determine. And then after the assassination of Uthman is when Imam Ali himself was given bay'ah in itself. And that's his own story surrounding that. And it's not enough time to go into it. But fundamentally, the Imam is supposed to be the Khalifa. And the Khalifa can only be the Imam, right? The Imam is supposed to be Khalifa, only Imam can be the Khalifa, can only be an Imam of the Ummah, right? And so Imam Tahawi includes this here, basically to say that indeed Abu Bakr was legitimate, indeed Umar was legitimate, indeed Uthman was legitimate, and of course we love Ali radiallahu anhu wa karramallahu wajha as well, right? We love him as well, but his khilafah, it came when it was supposed to happen, right? Or based upon the decisions of the Sahaba. And Sunnis respond, well, there's no clear evidence that the Prophet ﷺ appointed Ali ibn Abi Talib, even though there are certain incidents which give the impression that the Prophet ﷺ had been propping up, Ali's status, right, as his successor, right? But then there are many hadiths about Abu Bakr as well, because there's actually a disagreement among the Sunnis about whether or not the Prophet expressly had recommended or prescribed or ordered that Abu Bakr become a leader after his death, or it was just simply implicitly suggested by that in that sense. And so one of the differences between the 12ers and the Zaydis is that the 12ers say that the Prophet expressly said that Ali shall lead after me, but the Zaydiyas say, well, no, the Prophet he did say it, but he didn't say it expressly. There are suggestions. There are things that that intimate at this understanding that Ali should have been the Khalifa or the leader of the Muslims after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so after this he says, وَأَنَّ الْعَشَرَةَ الَّذِينَ سَمَّاهُمْ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ وَبَشَّرَهُم بِالْجَنَّةِ نَشَّرُ لَهُم بِالْجَنَّةِ على ما شهد لهم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وقوله الحق وهم أبو بكر وعمر وعثمان وعلي وطلحة والزبير وسعد وسعيد وعبد الرحمن بن عوف وأبو عبيدة بن الجراح وهو أمين هذه الأمة رضي الله عنهم أجمعين. So we testify as the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or Messenger of God subhanahu wa ta'ala before us. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We testify as the Messenger of God sallallahu alaihi wasallam before us that the 10 whom he designated and assured of paradise are indeed in paradise. His pronouncement is true, and they are Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, Talha, Az-Zubair, Sa'ad, Sa'id, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, and Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah, who is the trustee of this community. Right, so these often, when Sunnis speak about these 10 men, we say that these are the 10 Sahaba who have been promised Jannah. And again, what we need to understand too is that when we speak about the Sahaba in this way, the assumption is that, okay, if these 10 had been promised Jannah, then all the remaining Sahaba were not promised Jannah. And there's some truth to that, but also it's not complete, right? It's not completely accurate. But what that also means too, again, as I was emphasizing before, is that we don't treat all the Sahaba the same, right? Yeah, we love them, but we don't treat them all the same. That's part of Sunni doctrine, right? Some of them are superior to others. Some of them are more pious than others. Some of them are more knowledgeable than others, right? And so these 10 men who are mentioned here are what we can call the elders of the community, right? They are the people who the Prophet ﷺ has said that when he died, he was completely content with them, right? Mata wahum anhum radin, right? That he was content with them, satisfied with these men before they died. And there are hadiths where the Prophet ﷺ expressly states and lists them by name that the Nabiyyu fil Jannah, the Prophet is in Jannah, wa Abu Bakr fil Jannah, wa Umar fil Jannah, wa Talha fil Jannah, wa Uthman fil Jannah, right? He goes on, he lists all 10 of them, right? Stating that each one of them is in Jannah. And it's collected in multiple collections of hadith collections. You can find these hadiths mentioned. Now, of course, again, these are hadith that the Sahaba, the Shi'ah won't accept, right? But for the Sunnis, these are a very widespread hadith, right? Now, the Prophet also, so he mentioned these 10 not to limit the number of Sahaba who've been promised Jannah. There were people who died in battle when the Prophet ﷺ was alive. We know they're in Jannah too, right? There were people who died, Julaybi, they're people who died during the life of the Messenger ﷺ. All of his daughters, right? All of his children died, with the exception of Fatimah Zahra, right? And Fatimah was also promised Jannah, right? That when the Prophet ﷺ was fell ill and he was about to die, he, as the hadith states, and Aisha relates it, that the Prophet ﷺ, he whispered something to Fatimah, and Fatimah started to cry, radiallahu anha. And then he said something else to her, and then she started to laugh. So after he was buried, then Aisha returned to Fatima and said to her, on that day, I remember he said something to you, or Rasulullah said something to you, and you laughed and you cried, and then he said something to you, and then you laughed. And what was it? What did he say to you that made you cry? And so he said to me that he was soon going to leave this world, and that made me cry, knowing that he was soon going to be leaving this world. And then he said to me after that, أنتِ إنك أول من لحوقا به إنك أول من لحوقا به فنعم السلف أنا لك. That you, Fatima, you are the first of my family who will join me. And what a blessed predecessor am I to you. And so that made me happy. Why? Because I knew that once my father, once the Messenger of Allah left this world, that it wouldn't be very long after that I would join him, right, in Jannah, right? So there's 6 months later, after the Prophet's death, Fatima, she dies as well, right? So Hassan and Hussein, we know they're in Jannah, Sayyidah Shabab Ahl Jannah, right? The hadith of Bilal and Rabah that talks about, the Prophet asked them, why is it that I hear your footsteps before me in Jannah, right? So, I mean, the hadith is, there's some weakness in that hadith, but it's generally accepted as indicating that Bilal ibn Rabah is going to go to Jannah as well, right? So, and the other Sahaba too, right? So it's not only the 10, but again, this is a reference to the 10 elders of the community. In other words, they were the representatives of the Ummah, right? So this wasn't, we didn't have a democratic state, right? Sometimes you have Muslims who sort of promote this erroneous errant idea that, that Muslims had democracy early on and they had a constitution, what they call the Constitution of Medina, right? No, this was just generally the way that life was and continues to be largely even till in our own context. Like, for instance, people talk about the United States of America as a democracy. This is not a democracy. America has never been a democracy. None of our founding documents, at least to my knowledge, say that America is a democracy. It's a republic, right? And the republic is representative government, and democracy is actually you have true majority rule when every single vote counts, right? In other words, every time the government is going to make a decision, they have to appeal to the people, all the population, all the citizens, and all the citizens have a vote, right? And whatever the majority says, that is what the government is supposed to do, right? But we don't have that. As a matter of fact, that in itself we consider to be one of the most tyrannical forms of government, by the ancient Greeks, right? Aristotle and others, right? So fundamentally, that is not what we have. What we do have is what we call a republic. We have representative government where, we do vote for people. We vote them into office, at least many of them. There are some, unelected officials that we do have, who've been in their positions for a very long time, but most of our officials, we elect them, we vote them into office. But once they win, they're autocrats, right? They just, listen, there's nothing we can do about them until the next election cycle. So we really don't live in a democracy in that sense, right? And so, but in the same way, these 10 members of the community, that they were the elders, right? And that people respected their judgment. They didn't have to take counsel from the general population, but people deferred to them. They represented them. And so when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, it was them who decided, hey, Abu Bakr is going to become Khalifa. Now, Abu Bakr himself, he and Umar and Talha ibn Ubaidullah, they had received word when they were preparing the body of the Prophet ﷺ for burial, that the Ansar were about to elect Sa'd ibn Ubadah as the Khalifa, the leader. And so they rushed to the Saqifa of Bani Sa'ida, and they found them there. And then they got into a long sort of argument about like what should happen. The Ansar wanted to have their own leader, and wanted to say, the Quraysh, you Muhajirun have a leader, and we have a leader. Minkum Amir wa minna Amir. From you have an Amir. So we have two leaders, right? So Abu Bakr said, no, Antum, nahnu umara wa antum wuzara. No, we are the commanders, you are the ministers, right? And so until eventually Umar, he gives bay'at to Abu Bakr, and that's followed by the other members there, Talha and others, and then eventually the Ansar as well. They elect Abu Bakr, and then Sa'ad, he refuses to give bay'at to Abu Bakr himself, so eventually it goes out public, and Ali wasn't there. Zubayr and Awam were there as well at the particular election process, during that particular meeting, right? But they're representatives. So that's the fundamental point, that these people represented. So after the death of Abu Bakr, what does Abu Bakr do? Abu Bakr, he says, Umar, he's my successor. Nobody objects. There's no revolution. Nobody says, oh my God, this is a non-democratic process. What's wrong with these people? They're autocrats. No. Abu Bakr said, he's the leader, right? So Umar becomes the Khalifa. And then after Umar is stabbed by Abu Lu'lu'a, he's on his deathbed, and Umar decides to do what? He leaves the decision of who will be the next Khalifa to the remaining elders, right? Again, was Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, Sa'id ibn Zayd, there was Abdullah ibn Auf, Talha ibn Ubaidullah, Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah, Amir ibn Jarrah, right? I think I mentioned Abdurrahman, Uthman, Affan, and Ali, right? So those are the remaining people. He said, "Look, you all decide, you determine it, right?" So they didn't go out and, okay, we're gonna, send out ballots, right? But this is just the way that the world has pretty much always operated, right? You see, fundamentally, and so they were representatives in that sense, So they were the elders of the community, and they were also promised Jannah by the Prophet ﷺ. But they were not the only people promised Jannah by the Prophet ﷺ. And then lastly, we'll read verse 121, where he says, وَمَنْ أَحْسَنَ الْقَوْلَ فِي أَصْحَابِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ وَأَزْوَاجِهِ الطَّاهِرَاتِ مِنْ كُلِّ دَنَسٍ وَذُرِّيَّاتِهِ الْمُقَدَّسِينَ مِنْ كُلِّ رِجْسٍ فَقَدْ بَرِئَ مِنَ النِّفَاقِ. It said, whoever speaks well of the companions of the messenger of God, his chaste wives, and his purified progeny is absolved of hypocrisy. In other words, not only good speak well about them, the Sahaba, but even his wives, Aisha radiallahu anha, right? So you can't speak ill of Aisha radiallahu anha. This is one of the Prophet's wives, his favorite wife, as when he was asked that who is the most beloved of people to you, he says, Aisha. He says Aisha, and he said, and after and rijal, and among men, who's the next? He said Abuha, her father, right? So it's really very risky, I would say, to meet Allah Subhanahu wa Taala speaking ill of one of the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, the mothers of the believers, who was from the wives of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And so if a person speaks well of them, the companions and of the chaste wives, and his purified progeny, right, and his children, then that person, he is absolved of hypocrisy. And then, I'm sorry, I said that was the last one, but actually the next 122 will be the last one. وعلماء السلف من السابقين ومن بعدهم من التابعين أهل الخير والأثر أهل الفقه والنظر لا يذكرون إلا بالجميل ومن ذكرهم بسوء فهو على غير السبيل. That the pious scholars of the past and those after them who follow their path, the people of goodness and tradition of understanding and profound scholarship, should be mentioned only in the best manner. Anyone who speaks ill of them has deviated from the path. Now, of course, this includes Sahaba, but then now we're talking extended that to others. So, inshallah, tomorrow we'll resume from that particular verse, and we're going to speak about the matter of the karamat of the awliya, among other things, inshallah. So now we'll open up to any questions we have. Wa sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Muhammad wa alihi wa sallam. All right. So earlier, Sister Nabila mentions isn't that backbiting. So she said, sounds like people are talking about others. Does that only apply to the living? Well, backbiting is to say about someone behind their backs what they don't like. Is, of course, the Prophet ﷺ, his definition. But it also, of course, entails saying things about them, name calling, because Quran is very clear about that. That وَلَا تَلْمِزُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَلَا تَنَابَزُوا بِالْأَلْقَابِ. Yeah, you should not to call one another by offensive nicknames, right? So it includes that. So that's a difference in sort of name calling and backbiting, of course, as well. When you're saying things about people which may be true, but they wouldn't like for them to be said, right, to others. And there's 6 cases that the scholars say are permissible for one to backbite in, right? So among those situations are what's called tahdhir min ash-sharr, to warn someone against another person's evil, right? So I would imagine that for Shi'ah, for instance, who would speak ill of the Sahaba, that they would say that they're fundamentally we're warning people against the evil of Abu Bakr and Umar, and it's this one of many other 5 other cases which considered to be permissible for one to backbite. So in that sense, it would not be considered backbiting. It means sinful. It wouldn't be sinful in that situation, according to them. I remember I really struggled with this whole idea about cursing the companions, right? About reviling the companions. I remember I was quite inclining towards the position that anyone who speaks ill or curses a companion is a kafir. Right? That's because I felt like in the verse in Surah Tawbah where Allah says that He is pleased with them, He's promised them Jannah, prepare for them Jannah, or gardens beneath which rivers flow. That He's pleased with them, that we're pleased with Him, and it's speaking about the Sabiqun al-Awwalun and the Muhajirin al-Ansar. So the forerunners from the Muhajirin and the Ansar clearly are Abu Bakr and Umar, right? Clearly from the forerunners of the Ummah. And I find it very strange that somebody could say that they were hypocrites when the Messenger alayhi salatu wasalam, he married two of his daughters to Uthman, right? Uthman, he married two of the Prophet's daughters. And if he's a hypocrite, then that means the Prophet married his daughters to a hypocrite, knowing that they're hypocrites. And he had the names of all the hypocrites, we know that. And that's why Allah in the Quran tells them never to stand over their graves ever. Don't pray for them nor stand over their graves ever again. Because when he prayed over Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, Allah scolded him for that. So don't ever do it again. So he had knowledge. He knew who the hypocrites were. But he marries two of his daughters to Uthman ibn Affan. He marries the daughter of Abu Bakr. He marries the daughter of Umar. So he marries into the families of two hypocrites, which makes no sense at all to me. That it seemed like, to me, it's a diminution of the Messenger's stature, right, to entertain such an idea that the Prophet married he married the daughters or married into the families of two hypocrites, right? And then he also helped them close. They were very close to him. They were always around him. How many times the Prophet, I, Abu Bakr and Umar did this. Abu Bakr and Umar did that, right? And they were his closest companions, and in year 9, the Prophet ﷺ, he sent Abu Bakr to lead the Hajj delegation. Right? So if it's a hypocrite, you think the Prophet would actually appoint a hypocrite to lead the religious devotional services of someone? Right? When the Prophet fell ill, what did he do? He said, tell Abu Bakr to lead. He had Abu Bakr and lead. Right? Abu Bakr himself sacrificed all of his wealth. He was rich before the Prophet ﷺ claimed to be prophet or became a prophet, and they started to call his people to Islam. Abu Bakr, he suffered. He lost all of his wealth. His safety was threatened. Right? He starved and suffered with the Muslims in Mecca. Right? I find it very strange that someone could think that Abu Bakr himself was not a genuine Muslim. Right? And there's so many other examples of this. Umar is similar, right? So Umar, we know Umar, he became Muslim prior to the Hijrah, right? But he was, as well, right? He sacrificed quite a bit in Islam. So I would think that definitely it's backbiting, but I'm just making the point that they would argue probably that, okay, well, these people, the individuals who are not Muslims or people who are hypocrites or people who are not good Muslims, they don't have the same type of sanctity, right, that genuine pious Muslims have, right? So backbiting is a sin if it's against pious people, but these people in their viewpoint is not pious, so that's why I would say they probably would respond. Abdurrahman, he says, is criticizing non-Muslim politicians or attacking their personal faults considered the ghiba? Politicians are individuals who are responsible for society. And anyone who's responsible for others has to pass a morality test, right? There are two considerations with regard to holding any office. One is expertise, right, or experience, or experience. And then the second is moral integrity. And what we noticed is that when politicians are running against one another, that they are always target one or the other characteristic, right? Or both, right? Remember when Obama was running, they would say, "Oh, Obama, he doesn't have much experience. He's young. He's never been held office. He's only been a senator," right? That's what they were saying. It was, he's inexperienced. He's not qualified to hold office because of his lack of experience. And if not that, then what they'll do is they'll attack your moral integrity, right? So they say, "Oh, Trump, he slept with a prostitute," right? So he shouldn't be in office. Politicians, we need to know about politicians, right? And when that knowledge is public, especially, these are things that are known to those in their circles. Those individuals, more than anyone else, have the responsibility of letting us know, right, of these things. We're not talking about things that they're doing privately, right? Things they're doing private and they're trying to conceal from the public. They feel some sense of remorse and guilt about it, right? We're talking about open defiance of Allah's commandments. That when we discover those type of things, I do think it is important for them to be highlighted, because as a voting population, we want to be able to choose for these public offices the individuals who are most fit for them. We're never going to get a perfect candidate, right, in any office, of course, in our day and age, right? Just because of the nature of the system, nature of the beast, if we could say, right? But we can at least put more demands, right, on those individuals and decide which of them are more important. I'll give an example of this. I remember Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal was speaking about the question of a military chief or a general, right? So, and who should be chosen, right, if we have limited choices, right? And he said, for instance, let's say if one of the possibilities is an individual who's known to be pious, but doesn't really have much military experience, doesn't really understand how to strategize that well. On the other hand, we have another individual who's very good at strategy, a lot of know-how, knows how to fight, knows how to, carry out a military campaign, but it's not a very pious person. He said, you choose the second person, not the one who's pious. You choose the one who knows how to fight, even though that individual is not very pious. Why? Because the goal of war is to win. So you want to choose the individual who's most fit, right, to fulfill whatever the goals that exist, right? So criticizing non-Muslim or Muslim politicians, same thing with Muslim politicians. I think that we shouldn't give Muslims a pass just because they're Muslims. If Muslims are guilty of moral violations, right? If Muslims politicians are lack experience or lack courage that they need in order to get through whatever legislation or to get through or to sort of implement whatever important policies need to be enforced in society, then we shouldn't give them a pass or simply vote for them just because they're Muslims. I think we need to grow beyond that. That's a big problem I see we have, is this idea that, okay, they throw in our faces, okay, here's a black candidate. The person's black and the black people, oh my God, I'm going to vote for him just because, hey, he's black or she's black. No, right? Or it's a woman, right? It's a woman. We have to, it's a Muslim. Now, that in itself is very superficial. That in itself does not serve the interests of society. That the interests of society are served best when we actually look at objective criteria and we choose people not because of these superficial characteristics. Those are just, they're appealing to our emotions, right? And we suffer. Look what happened right now. Look, we had recession coming, if not already started. High inflation. Because everybody, what did they do? Hated Trump. So bad that we got to anything but Trump, right? Economy wasn't this bad under Trump, to be totally honest, right? So, but this is what we voted for, right? This is what people voted for, and this is what you get. So to criticize a non-Muslim politician, and I wouldn't necessarily call it attacking their faults. I think that, you know, we should highlight the faults of others, right, which were going to threaten their trustworthiness and their objectivity when they do their jobs. We should always highlight those things, you know, so that people can make an informed decision about who should be voted for or not, right? So I don't think it qualifies as backbiting. Well, first and foremost, what they would say about backbiting, that the rules of backbiting don't really apply to non-Muslims in general, but it applies to Muslims. In other words, not a sin to backbite a non-Muslim. But we should not make it a norm either. You know, because when you have a tendency to speak ill of non-Muslims, there's only a matter of time before you speak ill of a Muslim, right? So you should not habituate your tongue to speak ill of anyone, right? So that you don't fall into the red zone, right? So fundamentally, that's what Islam teaches us. Is there anything else? All right, so inshallah tomorrow, same time, 1 p.m. PST, 4 p.m. EST, inshallah, we'll resume the next topic we're going to be covering. We're going to start with the question of the marvels of the saints, or the pious people, the saintly figures of Islam, talk about issues of miracles, etc. So inshallah, looking forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. Sallallahu alaihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.